Mains points from the essay. Notes towards the definition of a category. 1. Nationalism should not be the factor to judge Third World literature or Indian literature. Because the Indian literary history is complex and multilingual literature is produced in India. 2. Nationalism is not same for every part of India, as India is full of diverse geographical spaces. For example, the Tamil literature does not share common ground with Assamese literature. 3. The lack of mutual sharing, communication and understanding among diverse India language and literature. 4. The lack of translations and lack of knowledge about diverse languages. 5. The dearth of institutional sites which undertake the task of studying, analyzing and critically reading the various language clusters in India in a comparative framework to construct a comprehensive understanding of what could be called Indian literature. 6. The individual scholar's work of researching multilingual Indian literature has not been acknowledged by the institutions. They should have carried forward by consolidating and disseminating these traditions among the students and scholars of college and university. 7. The problems in the availability of correct information regarding texts, authors, genres, modes of transmission and the circulation, and the nature of the audience and readership are a major hindrances which emerged via a long process of interaction and sharing. Besides, the history of such mutual influence is quite varied and uneven. For example, we have a very little reliable knowledge about the development of most of our Indian languages, like Tamil, Kannada and Sanskrit. 8. There are gaps in the available information. Consequently, it becomes difficult for anyone to talk concretely about the historical formation of Indian literature as a composite body. The severe lack of historical documentation makes impossible to carry out even a descriptive analysis of its unities, its generic forms circulating in a given period and the relationship between various works in a given period across an array of interacting linguistic clusters. 9. The lack of institutional support for undertaking the required critical scholarly studies. There are no ways of systematizing attempts and channelizing their fruits. The dearth of institutional space which could groom scholars to carry the tradition forward into contemporary times seriously hampers our understanding of Indian literary history. 10. The periodization of Indian literary history into India, Muslim and British periods. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Please read the PDF I have given and find out more points. 11. The most significant aspect of colonial, complex educational discourse was not viewing English language as alien by the Indian scholars, reformers, writers, artists and professionals. For example, the attitude of Ram Mohan Roy, Vivekanand, Sir Syed, Tilak and Gandhi towards English language was always one of the friendliness. It was also because most of the technical and scientific knowledge then available was only in English, as it was the language of the modern scientific and technological establishment. Consequently, it never became a point of cultural criticism among any section of the educated elite, even those who were actively engaged in the anti-colonial movement. The British imposition of English was primarily limited to the issues of administration and management of the government. 12. The teaching of English language was the same both for the Indian and the British children. Therefore, to learn the English language, both were supposed to study the poems of Milton and Wordsworth. Despite that, nobody became a Christian. According to Ahmad, it was only later that the secondary strata of the intelligentsia emerged who came to believe in the intrinsic literary merits of English language, and they did so because they experienced new literary genres and forms through the availability of world literature in English language. 13. The contributions in the pattern of colonial education facilitated the growth of class-based divisions of Indian intelligentsia. Nevertheless, the patterns of growth of these divisions are still far from clear and uneven because of the absence of historical empirical studies which would take into account the schooling patterns, caste backgrounds, class affiliations, religious inclinations, and linguistic capabilities of this variegated mass. Besides, most of these persons appropriated English as public and professional language along with Sanskrit or Persian as the languages of art and culture were reserved for household communication. 14. The gradual establishment of printing presses across the country aided literary and cultural production so that new kinds of reading publics were formed through the print revolution. English became the language which bridged regional and linguistic boundaries except in one or two cases where the regional language made ample use of the possibilities opened up by the printing press. It was the petty bourgeoisie who was torn apart by the opposing forces of professional and cultural pressures which were making their position precarious. 15. The growth of literary cultures in the regional languages was shaped by those strata of the society which were left behind as others moved closer to the power apparatuses of the colonial administration. These were the people who had traditionally played the role of intellectuals in pre-colonial India in the courts during the medieval times. These people did not belong to the traditional land-owning classes, as a result of which they were in alliance with the forces of democratization that were making inroads into the frozen layers of traditional social formations. This stratum attempted to negotiate the regional specificities with our collective civilizational unity against the colonizer in all kinds of religious and mystificatory forms of narrative. It was therefore only with the rise of the communist movement during the early part of the 20th century that a more secular and non-religious narrativization of Indian history started taking root in the collective sensibility of the people. It is because of these reasons that most of the scholars of the times showed a keen interest in the Bhakti movement. This was a medieval socio-cultural and artistic movement that spanned the entire geographical range of India, from the north to the south, and it questioned the many layered hierarchies embedded in the socio-cultural structures of the traditional Indian society. 16. The reform movements like Arya Samaj, Sanatan Dharm, Dar ul-Ulam and Nadwat ul-Ulema were mainly concerned with the revival of religious traditions of India, which could only have been done by revitalizing the learning of indigenous languages. A significant fact that needs to be acknowledged is that the reform movements greatly participated in the education of local masses through their own private institutions beyond the public and government institutions meant to impart literacy to the general public. Consequently, the educational reform movement got entangled with these movements as they were actively participating in the process of mass education and in building anti-colonial sentiment in the languages of the people. The negative aspect of this intermingling was the subsequent institutionalization of hierarchies in these historical sites itself, which culminated in the prioritization of the purity of the religious texts beyond all critical and secular inquiries. These developments severely hampered the processes of democratization and secularization of literary production. Even the modern intelligentsia, groomed in the traditions of modern critical and rational scholarship, succumbed to the temptations of their regional languages and the piousness of their religious texts beyond all critical engagement. On the other hand, there was the national movement which, in its own way, attempted to forge national unity against the colonizer. In the national movement also the regional languages played a crucial role by enabling people's mass participation. There were strands of revivalism in the national movement, but the emphasis was more on culture than religion. However, the secular movements often made spirituality the essential aspect of the everyday Indian life, and the newly emerging nation-state was given the task of leading the world in spiritual affairs. 17. Another major handicap in the development of Indian literature was the emergence of the English language as an independent force in higher education. The departments of English literature were set up throughout the country, and the study of the English literature, which is to say the texts not written in English in India but imported from elsewhere, became the only standardized literature with its own methods of analysis, reading tools and textual criticism all over India. There were departments of Hindi or other languages also, but none of them got the status of an English department. Moreover, the study of regional language literatures remained confined to their own specific geographical locations without ever seeing the light of the national stage. This was surely an achievement, as Ahmad says, but the problem was the lack of any attempt to systematically relate the varied histories of the development of different language literatures into a comprehensive composite history without actually neglecting the contributions of any one of them. The main reason for this, he further argues, was the lack of any national language which could have provided a common linguistic platform to frame such a composite history of Indian literature. 18. Ahmad writes that there were very few pressures of professionalization, such as acquisition of PhDs, academic hierarchies, publications, and even fewer institutional challenges. The profession was thus relatively less professionalized, considering the demands and opportunities in the modern times. But it was also important that the teachers of English came mainly from progressive backgrounds and belonged to secular nationalist or communist parties, or were active crusaders for civic reform. As such, they nurtured their creative potential in their regional languages and never questioned the literary merits of the Indian regional languages. So there was a given bilinguality which enabled them to confront the split within themselves. But this is no longer the situation, as the demands of the professionalization and Americanization of education have created a new kind of academic bureaucracy which values those professional credentials which can be profitable both personally and professionally in the academic market. Of journals, publications, book trade, conferences and seminars. He argues that the fate of Indian literature does not seem very bright within the existing social context unless there is an arduous effort on the part of scholars and institutions to support the study of such a difficult, diverse and complex object of study. Moreover, the domain of the examination of Indian literature demands an intentional effort to go beyond disciplinary boundaries, since Indian literature, as the object of study, actually exists in a larger area, much of which is overlapping or indeterminate. It is only through such an effort that any significant understanding of Indian literature may be articulated. 19. Ahmad ends his essay by articulating his own vision of scholarship in literary studies. The literary studies should be undertaken under a broader discipline of historical and cultural studies. He defends the teaching of the English language and English literature from historical and political perspectives, and also because English has become firmly embedded in the basic socio-cultural dynamics of post-colonial India, in addition to its position at the international level as the preferred language of commerce, communication and technology. The study of English literature is also important because England was the country where the problems of modern industrial and capitalist societies first manifested themselves and where people launched multifarious struggles against the brutality of capitalist industrialization. Ahmad cites the exemplary case of Professor Kosambi, whose unmatched scholarship and integrity should be our guiding model in the departments of literature. The discipline of Indian literature needs to do what Professor Kosambi did for Indian historiography.